The interceptor behind the deadliest mistake in Cold War aviation never fought a war. It never faced an enemy fighter. It never fired a shot at anything that could shoot back, and it still killed 271 civilians aboard 2 unarmed airliners. The Sukhoi Su-15. NATO called it the Flagon. Everyone else eventually called it the Boeing killer. So here's what makes this strange. This wasn't a bad aircraft. By the narrow standard it was built to meet, it worked. 1,290 were built. It served for nearly 3 decades. And it did exactly what its designers asked of it. That's the problem. The Su-15 didn't fail. It succeeded twice. And both times the thing it succeeded at was killing people who had no idea they'd done anything wrong. There's a shallow version of this story, and there's the real one. The shallow one ends right here. The real one has 3 parts. Part 1. The pilot who pulled the trigger in 1983 has spoken on the record, and what he says he saw through the cockpit glass is worse than the official story ever was. Part 2. You've probably heard that this shootdown is why your phone has GPS. That story is repeated everywhere. It's also wrong, and the date that proves it is 1974. Part 3. There's a third fatal Su-15 intercept that almost nobody counts. 4 dead, July 18, 1981. And 4 decades later, people still can't agree on whether the pilot did it on purpose. Start with why this aircraft exists at all, because the sequence matters. The thing keeping Moscow awake in the 1950s was the B-52 Stratofortress. Introduced into U.S. Air Force service in 1955, it was big, it was jet-powered, and it was designed to fly a very long way with a very large weapon. The Soviets needed something that could climb fast, fly high, and kill it before it got where it was going. Sukhoi's first answers were the Su-9 and its improved cousin, the Su-11. Fast, delta-winged, genuinely capable climbers. But both had the same 2 problems, and over Soviet territory, both problems were serious. 1 engine. Lose it over 4,000 miles of nothing and you ain't walking home, buddy. And a nose intake, which meant there was almost nowhere to put a radar. The Su-15 fixed both at once. 2 engines instead of 1. Side-mounted intakes, which freed the entire nose for a solid radome and a real search and track set behind it. First flight came on May 30th, 1962. It was officially commissioned on April 3rd, 1965, and the public got its first look at the 1967 Moscow Aviation display. Now, the numbers. And this is where most write-ups quietly get it wrong, so I want to be careful with the dates. The early Su-15s flew on Tumansky R-11 F2 S-300 engines with an RP-22 Oriole radar in that new nose. The R-13 engines and the Typhoon radar, most people quote, came later. Su-15T and TM. Put the late engines on a 1965 airframe and you've built a jet that never existed. Top speed, roughly Mach 2.1. Service ceiling, 18,100 meters. Rate of climb, around 228 meters per second, which is genuinely ferocious and which is also where the popular 20,000 meters in 3 minutes line comes from. It can't. That's above the aircraft's own ceiling. But let's be clear about what this thing was because it explains everything that follows. The Su-15 was never a dogfighter. It was a ground-controlled interceptor, and the distinction isn't academic. Radar operators on the ground found the intruder. They scrambled the jet. They vectored it. The pilot closed at speed, took the contact on his own radar, and fired. The weapon was the R-98, which NATO called the AA-3 Anab. Big missile. Mach 2, roughly 40-kilogram fragmentation warhead, and you carried them in pairs. 1 radar-guided, 1 heat-seeking, because firing both doubled your chance of a hit. Later aircraft could also carry the little R-60, an 8-kilometer heat-seeker with a 3-kilogram warhead. Notice what's missing from that list. There's no procedure in it for figure out what you're actually shooting at. The pilot wasn't the decision-maker. He was the delivery system. And here's the detail that tells you how the Soviets felt about this aircraft. They never exported it. Not to Warsaw Pact allies, not to client states. Nobody. In an era when Moscow sold MiGs and Sukhois to almost anyone with hard currency, the Flagon stayed home because it was welded to the secrets of PVO Strany, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, a separate branch of the military whose entire job was Soviet airspace. So that's the machine. Now here's the question this video actually exists to answer. How does an interceptor that never fought a war end up with the worst civilian body count in the history of fighter aviation? The answer starts on April 20th, 1978. Korean Airlines. Flight 902, a Boeing 707 with 109 people aboard, was flying Paris to Seoul by way of Anchorage. Somewhere over the Arctic, near the magnetic pole, the navigation went wrong. Instead of crossing toward North America, the aircraft turned and flew into Soviet airspace near the Kola Peninsula and the naval complex at Murmansk. PVO Strany scrambled. Captain Alexander Bosov closed on the intruder, got a visual, and read the markings. He identified it correctly, a South Korean civilian airliner. And he reportedly tried to tell the ground exactly that. Vladimir Tsarkov, the local air defense commander, ordered him to fire anyway. Bosov fired 2 missiles. The first missed. The second took roughly 4 meters off the left wing. But then something almost absurd happened. Nope, it was absurd. Soviet radar tracked the tumbling wing section, decided it looked like a cruise missile, and sent a second Su-15 up to shoot at the debris. Captain Kim Chang-kyu put the crippled 707 down on the frozen surface of Korpijärvi Lake, about 140 kilometers from the Finnish border. 107 people walked away. 2 didn't. A salesman from Seoul named Bang Tai-hwang was killed instantly by shrapnel. A Japanese passenger, Yoshitaka Sugano, was hit in the right arm and shoulder and bled to death. Zarkov, for what it's worth, was cashiered for it. Serious incident, real diplomatic damage, and in 5 years it would look like a rehearsal. September 1st, 1983. Korean Airlines. Flight 007, a Boeing 747, 269 people aboard, New York to Seoul with a fuel stop at Anchorage. One of the passengers was Larry McDonald, a sitting United States congressman from Georgia, and since earlier that year, chairman of the John Birch Society. He was one of the most vocally anti-communist figures in American politics. Of every seat on every airplane in the world that night, he was in that one, and he almost wasn't. Bad weather had diverted his connection through Baltimore, and he missed his original flight by 2 or 3 minutes. Rather than pay a higher fare on another carrier, he waited for the next Korean Airlines departure. Senator Jesse Helms was headed to the same event in Seoul, booked on Korean Airlines Flight 015. The two of them talked about flying together. The accounts split on which direction the offer ran, whether Helms considered moving up to 007 or asked McDonald to drop back to 015. And I'm not going to pretend I know for sure and can settle it. What isn't in dispute is the outcome. They stayed on separate airplanes. Flight 015 landed in Seoul. After Anchorage, the 747 began drifting right, of course. It was supposed to fly Romeo 20, the established transoceanic corridor. Instead, it wandered progressively westward, over the Kamchatka Peninsula, and then over Sakhalin Island, 2 of the most sensitive military zones the Soviet Union had. The cause was almost certainly a navigation mode error. The Anchorage Vive OR beacon was out of service, and the evidence points to the autopilot flying a magnetic heading instead of tracking the INS, the inertial navigation system, the onboard gyro and accelerometer array that keeps position without any ground signal. As the magnetic variation shifted westward, that fixed heading walked the aircraft further and further off track. And here's the part that mattered. Once the jet drifted more than 7.5 nautical miles from the programmed route, selecting INS wouldn't have captured it anyway. The system would have sat armed and waiting for a track it was never going to reach. The crew, as far as anyone can tell, never knew. There was one more ingredient. A U.S. Air Force RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft had been working off Kamchatka that day, in international airspace, waiting on a scheduled Soviet missile test. Soviet air defense first read the airliner as a KC-135 tanker, then decided it was a second RC-135. I want to be careful here, because this is the easiest part of the story to get wrong. The 2 aircraft never actually got close. Minimum separation was around 75 nautical miles. The confusion was real. The "they were flying" formation version is not. PVO Strani scrambled. Major Gennadi Osipovich went up in an Su-15 TM. And what he said afterward is the reason this story still lands. He closed on the aircraft. He could see the navigation lights flashing. He could see the windows. I saw 2 rows of windows and knew that this was a Boeing. I knew this was a civilian plane, but for me, this meant nothing. Read that again. Not "I couldn't tell," not "it was dark." He knew, and it changed nothing. And he explained why in one sentence that is the entire Cold War, compressed into 13 words. It is easy to turn a civilian type of plane into one for military use. He says he tried to warn them. He fired his cannon 3 times, 520 rounds, but the shells had no tracers and were invisible in the dark. He flashed his lights. He never keyed the radio, and his reason was as flat as everything else he said about that night. How can I talk with him? You must know the language. The order came down through Anatoly Kornikov, commanding at Sokol Air Base on Sakhalin. Osipovich has described what an order like that meant to a PVO pilot. For us, that is everything. It means that we just have to go up and kill someone. He fired 2 missiles. The first was radar-guided, with a proximity fuse, and it detonated about 50 meters behind the tail. Flight 007 came down in the Sea of Japan near Monoron Island. 269 people. Nobody survived. If you want the version of these stories that checks the primary statement and the actual test record instead of repeating the headline, that's what Vault Media does. Consider subscribing. Now, honesty requires the other side of this ledger, and it cuts in more than one direction. The Soviet air defense picture that night was genuinely bad. A real reconnaissance aircraft really had been working the same airspace hours earlier. The intruder really was over Kamchatka and Sakhalin. And the crew of Flight 007 really had made a navigational error that nobody on board caught for 5.5 hours. None of that gets anyone to the trigger. Osipovich has told us himself that he identified it as a civilian Boeing before he fired. The failure wasn't the radar picture. The failure was a system that had no step between unidentified and destroy, and a pilot who didn't think one was needed. The reaction was volcanic. Reagan called it the Korean airline massacre, a crime against humanity, an act of barbarism. Secretary of State George Shultz took it to Gromyko in Madrid and told him the Soviet response was totally unacceptable, and the US put its intelligence evidence in front of the United Nations. Moscow denied it, then admitted it, then claimed the airliner had been on an American intelligence mission and pointed at the RC-135. No evidence for that has ever surfaced. What Moscow did not mention was that on October 20th, 1983, 50 days after the shootdown, Soviet ships found the wreckage. They recovered the recorders. The cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder, the 2 objects on Earth that would have proven the crew was lost rather than spying, went into a safe and stayed there for 9 years. Russia handed the containers to South Korean President Roh Tae-woo in November of 1992. The tapes reached ICAO on January 8, 1993. Which brings us to the claim you've almost certainly heard about this story. You'll read everywhere that Flight 007 is the reason GPS is available to civilians. It's a clean story. It's also not what happened, and the primary document is public. 16 days after the shootdown, on September 16, 1983, a statement went out from the White House. It wasn't Reagan at a podium. It was Deputy Press Secretary Larry Speakes, and the operative sentence is narrower than the legend. The president has determined that the United States is prepared to make available to civilian aircraft the facilities of its global positioning system when it becomes operational in 1988. Civilian aircraft, a system that wasn't operational yet. An offer, not a declassification, and the civil signal wasn't a concession wrung out of the Pentagon by a massacre. A 1974 program document already said the system would provide a navigation signal in the clear to both the military and the civil user. That's 9 years before Sakhalin. Texas Instruments was selling commercial GPS receivers to land surveyors in 1982, a year before Osipovich ever took off. So the honest version is this. The shootdown didn't invent civilian GPS. What it did was take a technical intention buried in a 1974 document and turn it into a public presidential commitment, with a date attached, aimed squarely at the problem that had just killed 269 people. That commitment then held and widened. Selective availability switched off under Clinton in 2000, made permanent policy under Bush in 2007. That's a smaller claim than, "This is why your phone works." It's also true, and it's the more interesting story because it's about how a technical decision gets locked in, not invented, which leaves the incident nobody counts. July 18th, 1981. A Canadair CL-44 freighter, Argentine-operated, running American-made tank parts and ammunition from Tel Aviv to Tehran by way of Larnaca, arming Iran against Iraq. It strayed into Soviet airspace over the Azerbaijan Republic, and Su-15 intercepted and signaled it to land. The freighter did not comply. The two aircraft collided. The CL-44 went down near Yerevan, killing all 4 people aboard, 3 Argentine crew, and a Scottish charter organizer named Stuart Allen McCafferty. The Soviet pilot ejected and survived. And here's where I have to hedge because the sources genuinely split. The Soviet pilot said he rammed it deliberately. Western analysts who went through his account concluded he'd misjudged the turn, hit the freighter by accident, and built a self-sacrifice story afterward. Both readings are still on the table. Anyone telling you flatly that this was the great deliberate ramming of the Cold War is picking a side, the evidence doesn't settle. Add those 4, and the Su-15's real total isn't 271. It's 275. The end came quietly. Russia retired the fleet in the mid-1990s under the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, and most airframes went straight to the scrappers. Ukraine's last Su-15s at Kramatorsk and Belbek were withdrawn in 1996. The MiG-31 and the Su-27 took the job. No Air Force flies the Flagon today. What's left sits in museums. 2 things in the reporting don't sit together comfortably, and I'd rather say so than smooth it over. The first is that the sources can't even agree on what to call the aircraft that did this. Some references list the Su-15TM as Flagon E. Others list it as Flagon F and give E to the earlier Su-15T. That's a NATO reporting name on the most infamous interceptor of the Cold War, and it's still unsettled. The second is bigger. Osipovich gave interviews for years afterward and never expressed regret, and he still insists the aircraft was on a spy mission. But in the same conversations, he also said he'd rather have forced it down and shared a bottle with the pilot. Both of those came out of the same man. I don't think they resolve, and I don't think I should pretend they do. His bonus for the shootdown, by the way, was 200 rubles, minus a deduction for postage. When we covered have heat, the entire point of that test was taking away the machine's crutch. Radar off. No data link feeding it the answer. Make the AI find the target by itself, off nothing but heat, because in the earlier trials the target had effectively been helping the AI see it. Decades of engineering aimed at one question: can it identify what it's looking at, unaided? Osipovich solved that problem in 1983. 200 meters, his own eyes. A perfect identification. A Boeing, civilian, 2 rows of windows. And it changed nothing. That's the line neither spec sheet has. Identification was never the hard part. What the chain of command does with the identification is. Because in the end, the Su-15 worked. It climbed. It intercepted. It put its weapons on target. Judged by its own requirement document, this aircraft was a success. That's what should bother you. Not a machine that failed. A machine that did precisely what it was asked to do, on a night when the only thing standing between an airliner and a missile was one man, deciding that 2 rows of windows meant nothing. The engineering wasn't the problem. It never was. Thanks for sticking with this one all the way through. A story this ugly is easy to tell badly, and getting the dates and the documents right takes real time. The fact that you're here for the sourced version and not just the headline is what makes this channel worth building.